Hello everyone and welcome to the Maxon booth here at SIGGRAPH 2023. Hello, hi, hello internet. It's good to see you again. It has been far too long. I am accompanied by some world-renowned artists that are here to inspire, educate, and motivate you on all the different amazing tools of Maxon One. Starting off, longtime friend, virtual production. I've seen you at the 3D Motion show a couple years back when we were all virtual, but now live in person, the one, the only, Alex Parker. Let's give a big round of applause.
Thank y'all. Super cool. Okay, well, good morning and welcome to Maxon's very first presentation of SIGGRAPH 2023. So glad to be here. Today's chit chat is called Animating a Brand. So we're going to be looking through 2 different brand animations. But first of all, hello. My name is Alex Parker. So great to be here. I'm a full-time animator based in Texas. I've been working in cinema for about the past 5 years or so. Loved every minute of it. In those past 5 years, I've had the joy of animating for a couple of really fun brands like Google, EA Games, most recently Disney Parks, which has been a bunch of fun. And then I've also had the express joy of designing and animating for my very own brand, Ladybird Animation. And so today, we're going to be looking through, breaking down 2 different brand manifesto, brand intro animations. So this chit chat will be a little bit creative direction, a little bit technical execution as we go through how we break down these brands to their most fundamental elements, how we translate those elements into concrete visual cues, and then how Cinema 4D brings those cues to life. And so these are the 2 brands we'll be looking at today. Kicking off with Magenta Watson. Magenta Watson is this trendy, hip bicycle brand. The demographic for this brand was college-age students, young professionals. Some of the pillars that we took away from the brand guidelines of this brand were customized bicycle building. So bicycles for long distance, short distance, tall, short, all that good stuff. But one of the main pillars of this brand was making that process super, super simple, not making it an overwhelming process for our consumers. At the same time, we pulled away that simplicity found in our brand guidelines as well. So if we look at the logo, really, really simple geometric shapes, really echoing the simplicity of the bicycle buying process with this brand. And we also took away their very groovy brand motto, wheel good, feel good. And so these are a couple of the key pillars we took away and that we pulled from when making creative decisions for building out the brand intro for this brand. So I'll go ahead and play that, and then we can see kind of a retrospective of how we took all these brand guidelines and itemized them into really actionable list of things to do to get that brand guideline off the ground. So, go ahead and play this.
We've done it. Boutique bicycles for boutique people. We are Magenta Watson. Going across town for coffee or across campus for class. We get you, and we get you there. With a size for every ride and a speed for every need. Time to upgrade your ride? Bring it back, and we'll happily recycle your bicycle to pedal another day. And when you purchase one bicycle, we'll share one, connecting the world one ride at a time. Magenta Watson. Wheel good, feel good.
Alrighty, so that is our brand spot, and so we're going to break down a couple of the key creative direction steps we took in designing this spot, but then we'll also cross the bridge over into how we executed this spot. And so, first of all, our first step was creating a very, very universal shape library for us to pull from when we were building out this spot. We wanted it to be very, very simplistic, abstracted. We wanted to make sure that this brand spot had a good shelf life. As your brand evolves, you want to make sure that your brand intro video still feels good a couple years later and doesn't feel outdated. And so when we broke down a bicycle brand, we thought, what's the one thing that a bicycle brand can probably be expected to have for a very long time? Probably bicycle wheels. And so we started here, and this was, of course, our main character throughout the spot, which introduced the use of course, circles throughout the spot. If you think about the way bicycle spokes naturally cut up a circle, we get these nice semicircles, which introduce the idea of maybe some fun geometric arcs that we see throughout the spot. This is, of course, a clear bridge over to the use of squares throughout our spot as well. If we can cut a circle in half, we can certainly cut a square in half. And so that introduced the idea of these fun geometric triangles, which build a very clear bridge over to our geometric brand logo. So very, very full circle. And so taking these very intentional steps to build out this kind of very simplistic shape library, we were able to have a fun time kind of abstracting our big ideas. So for example, riding this bike across campus, across town. You had this very abstracted map over here, and so it was a fun way for us to kind of build a little sandbox for ourselves where anything we pulled from it felt on brand and felt cohesive with Magenta Watson's brand guidelines. And so the fun part about this is if we look at all these shapes, they are very, very easy to replicate with Cinema 4D spline tools. And so our first little hop into Cinema 4D is going to be a look at how we essentially used all of Cinema 4D's spline tools to bring this to life. So I'll go ahead and play through this. This is that same spot that we just looked at, the entire thing in one big shot in Cinema 4D. And the entire thing is almost entirely animated and extruded spline shapes. So very, very simple. And what was fun about these is that spline shapes can be booled, so you're working in a very non-destructive workflow, which was super, super handy as we kind of worked on this, keeping everything really, really flexible. And so what I'll go through here, I'm going to go in and give a quick chit-chat on a couple of the different spline animation methods that we used in creating this spot. First off is, I'll hide this one, is a simple pose morph. So going simply from shape A to shape B, super, super simple. We've got that stored in this pose morph tag over here. If we go over to our edit mode, we'll see we've got the same spline shape that we've just kind of morphed from this hills pose over to this kind of stylized cloud pose that we see throughout the shot. Go back into animate mode and we can see that we've got this very, very linear interpolation between those two shapes. Nothing much to look at here, quite honestly, but it gets groovier. So, I find the benefits of a pose morph method to be that you can store a really nice library of shapes that you can always go back to. You're not having to recreate these shapes every time, which I find really, really great for if you're using any sort of spline-based mouth shapes for character animation. You can go in and store all your different vowel shapes as blend shapes or pose morph shapes, so you can always go back to that library, and it's really nice to have those all tucked away. But what I also find is this nice little hidden gem that I tend to use if I'm using pose morphs in Cinema 4D. All I'm doing is giving this curve a nice ease, which, of course, we can all guess what that might look like. But the fun little hidden gem I like to use is pulling these down below 0 a little bit, and then pulling this above 100, because what a pose morph will do is interpolate and kind of extrapolate the trajectory of your shapes on your behalf. And so what we'll get is instead a nice kind of little anticipation and then overshoot that I didn't have to do by hand. So it's really, really helpful in speeding up my animation workflow when I can rely on my pose morph curve to give me that extra little bit of spice on my behalf. But what we'll also find is sometimes I find that if I'm using the pose morph method, my tangents don't always behave the way I expect them to. I get some unexpected results sometimes if I'm making a really extreme change in the tangent of a Bezier curve. And so in those cases, I'll either tackle that by hand or I'll use what I call the PLA method, simply just point level animation changes. And so in that case, what I've got here is I've simply taken this little curve. This is a hill shape and a stair shape taken straight from the Magenta Watson project. Very, again, simple point A to point B linear animation that we have here. But what I find is if we remember the Magenta Watson shot, I can go back over here. A lot of these shots are stitched together by really nice match cuts. And so being able to control the velocity at which a curve enters and exits its pose was really key in making sure all these shots felt really nicely stitched together. And so that's something that we can absolutely do with the point level animation method here. You'll see we'll drag this in here and we're not finding the curve that we expect to see. I want to be able to adjust that speed curve and I'm not seeing it. It's still here. We just have to go one level deeper to go grab it. So what I'm going to do is right click here. Is the right click not set up on this mouse? Oh no. Oh no. Matt? Okay, so what I would do is I would right click on this mouse and I would get a time track. And what I would then do is assign that time track to this curve, and that time track works very similarly to the way that a speed curve might work in After Effects. So you can take that speed curve and you can adjust it. What if I go into system preferences right now? What if we do it live and we go in here and that's what I thought, right? Command click, control click. That secondary click. Are we? Okay, bingo. Okay. Thank you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a special track and I'm going to add a time track. What's cool about these is we can name them in case you're using multiple. So I'm going to call this a time track test and click on that. And that presents this linear line that we're seeing right here. It does seem to go on for forever. So we're going to go grab it. And the animation that I have set up here for my point level animation is about 20 frames long. So I'm going to grab this curve and drag it all the way back to 20 so that it's got a really clear connection and maps much more predictably to my animation curve. Dun, da, da, da. Okay, so I'm going to pull that out, and I'm going to give this the ease that we were hoping to see. So for this, let's stylize it with maybe like a really quick start and a really nice ease on the back end. We'll play this, and we'll see that this is still a very lame linear interpolation. We haven't assigned this time track curve to this specific animation yet. So if I go into my point level animation, it's going to ask for a time track. I can go over here and assign it to the time track we've just created. And now we see that we're getting kind of that like quick start and that easy ease that we were looking for. So I find that between these two methods, I end up with a lot of distinct control over how my curves behave. I find specifically with the point level animation method that I get a little bit more control, which I really like. It gives you the opportunity to go in and maybe add some distinct poses in your interpolation. So instead of just going A to B, you can insert some really custom poses, which are really helpful in getting really fun stylized animation. And so anywho, that covers a lot of how we animated that Magenta Watson spot. It was almost entirely spline based. And so this covered a lot of our bases. But if we hop back in to this little presentation here, we're going to continue and talk about what I think is often a very, very powerful but underrated tool when creative directing a spot, which is your camera lens selection. And so I think it's very, very simple. When we get into Cinema 4D, any 3D program, you get in and your camera's already set up, so it's really tempting to just rock and roll with that camera that you already have in your scene. But for this one specifically, what we were looking for to really adhere to the simplicity of our brand guidelines, if we look at all of these shapes, we had a lot of stacked shapes on top of each other, a lot of kind of stacked wooden pieces. And we wanted those to feel really clean. We didn't want those to distort the higher we stacked and the closer they got to camera. And so for this, we went with a super telephoto lens to make sure we could really flatten that scene. And so to demonstrate that, I'm going to hop in here and we'll take a look at the effects that you'll see as we change the focal length property of a camera. So this simple demo scene, what's going on here is we've got this camera all the way back here. And as we scrub through, the focal length of this camera is getting longer and longer, and then it's pulling back in Z space to account for that change in focal length. So that's what's happening behind the scenes, but if we look into this camera here, and if we open its object properties, you can keep an eye on this little field right here, and we'll see how that change in focal length really affects the final visual that you get out of your camera. And so for the use of, in the case of Magenta Watson, we wanted this really, really flat effect. So right here, we can see we've maxed out our super telephoto focal length, and that really helps flatten our scene and keep everything feeling really, really nice and crisp, really clean, really flat. But for example, a sample Cinnamon Toast Crunch project we worked on a couple years ago, the vibe of that brand was a much more comedic brand. We also had really, really tiny characters who do not take up all that much room on our stage, and we wanted to make sure and maximize those tiny comedic characters' screen space as much as possible. So in those cases, we used a much shorter focal length because you almost get this, it's like this very comedic, goofy, like looking at somebody through a hotel like peephole kind of feel. And so a camera selection can, I think, really, really help you understand or help your audience understand the vibe of your brand. It's one of those choices that's more so, I think, felt more than it is seen. But I think going the extra mile to really understand the vibe, the undertone of your brand, and how that might translate to a camera lens selection can really help add an extra level of polish and understanding to your brand as you're crafting out your brand intro spots. So we will scoot right along here, and we'll also see, back it up, that flattening effect really helped us out here in this final scene. I call this the pie chart scene. This final scene right here, where all these shapes kind of had to tuck away into each other to arrive at this final lockup right here. So if we look kind of behind the scenes, we can kind of see, just how much we were relying on all of these pieces tucking cleanly behind each other and not distorting as they got closer to camera, so that we could kind of get a little bit of trickery going on to get us from here all the way to here. What's happening behind the scenes, we're turning shapes off, we're making them shorter, we're stacking them on top of each other, but keeping that scene really, really flat helped us get away with this final transformation and really help sell that very, very clean, crisp geometry depiction that we were looking for to stick to our brand guidelines. So that, let's see, we did that. Great. Okay, so that is the end of our wrap up for the Magenta Watson project. So quick credits. This project was executed under the studio Infinite Fiction. It is now rebranded to Republic Design, oversight by Cody Clack, sound design and mix by Greg Carlson, and it was executive produced by none other than Amy Aitken. Absolute dream team. So we'll scoot right along. The second brand that we're going to do a breakdown of, my personal favorite, this is my personal brand, Ladybird Animation. So we'll do a quick breakdown. What is Ladybird? Ladybird Animation is an animation and creative education brand. This brand is currently kind of in that transition from being a full-time freelance brand to a creative education brand. So this brand is kind of feeling that shift right now. The brand is built on this very simple, joyful color palette that's meant to really pull back to kind of the nostalgic 50s era cartoons. And so with that, we find that this brand uses a lot of mid-century shape language, and that this brand really thrives on like a childlike playfulness and a really handmade quality. And so when I'm looking to translate these brand pillars into concrete visuals, I end up doing so through really, really chunky shapes, really imperfect shapes, shapes that look like maybe a child went in and made them themselves. When we're illustrating things, we're not thinking, well, what does a leaf look like? We're thinking, how would a child draw a leaf? So that's kind of how we get to some of our concrete visuals in that way. We also find some of these little doodly shapes we use as well. So I use a lot of 2D illustrated shapes on just flat alpha maps and flat planes. And then one of the other fun rules that we take away from these brand guidelines is that Doris, this is Doris here, she's our brand bird, is that Doris should always be introduced in strict profile anytime she's brought into a scene, because she does have this cameo in our logo. So we want to make sure anytime she's brought into a scene that that connection is super, super clear, that we always see her in strict profile first, and then she's free to do whatever she would like. And so those are our main takeaways from this brand. We'll take a look at how we translated those into the brand video. But first off, we're going to kick off the international debut of a brand new animation for Ladybird Animation. So here we go. Alrighty, so that is our brand new brand intro for Ladybird Animation. Thank y'all so much, my little blue baby. So we'll go ahead and let's just kind of play. No, we won't. We'll just go straight into the slide. So when looking at this brand animation, and thinking about how did I want to build this out? What are some of the creative direction notes that I want to give myself as I'm translating my brand from kind of my own guidelines into kind of a visual kickoff that I can give this brand? So very, very similarly to the process in the Magenta Watson brand, kind of boiling a brand down to its most basic elements. In this case, when I boil down Ladybird Animation, I find that the big idea there is celebrating the creative process, really enjoying and finding joy in the transformation that you go through when you go from that initial idea to your final render. So kind of finding the joy in the transformation that you go from in the journey from like napkin sketch to screen. But at the same time, this is also now more of an animation education brand. And I think that transformation still holds true when you look at the journey from kind of learning a new skill to finally understanding it. There's kind of, I think, a very similar journey you go through in kind of like, I've got an idea and now I've made the idea. And so this brand is about really making that a joyful process. It should be joyful to work with Ladybird Animation. That's one of my key pillars. And so making that a really fun journey and celebrating that journey is kind of what I wanted to do here. And I wanted to do that through a visual metaphor that felt specific to Ladybird Animation, not a metaphor that some other brand could just come along and grab and put it in their stuff and it would fit right in. It needed to feel unique to this brand. And so I landed on this idea of an egg, which seems extremely simple now because of course birds come out of eggs, but this took a long time to arrive at this conclusion. But I think that's a very natural evolution, kind of seeing us go from this place to this final big reveal of Doris, our brand bird. And so we're going to keep talking about this egg because as we think back to our brand guidelines, that really fun cartoony shape language is a big part of the brand. And so one of the creative challenges I had here was having this egg kind of burst out like this, having those little birdie feet pop out. And so my default thought was, well, let's use one of Cinema's Voronoi fractures. That'll feel really good. Get a lot of fun physical cracks coming out of this egg. But at the same time, I realized I just want to have a lot of creative control over the shape of these little birdie feet holes coming out here. So we actually did this by putting 2 eggs in our scene. So what we're looking at here is our main egg. There's actually 0 shattering effects happening on this egg. The only thing happening on the egg we're looking at right now is this alpha map on the left. So I'll play through that one more time. So this egg simply has an animated alpha map that I animated in After Effects and kind of timed it to the animation of our scene. And then we see here that we get this nice stylized like punch out. If you also see here, those 2 little shapes kind of shifted down a bit as the egg stood up, just to make sure that those holes tracked with the feet. Is it physically accurate? Absolutely not, but we don't do that at Ladybird Animation. And so that's how we tackled the stylized star shapes on this first egg, but we still have to address how we tackled the actual shatter pieces that came out of those 2 little star shapes. And so I'm going to hop in here and yes, egg shatter demo. Hop over here. Here's how we tackled that. So this is kind of an abbreviated version of our scene here. I've pulled this egg out and we can see if we play through it, there's actually 2 eggs in play here. Here's that main egg we looked at earlier. And then here's these kind of dedicated shatter pieces. And so if we take a brief tour through our object manager, we'll see we have this rig here, all of this to control this one little bitty egg. But here's our main egg here. We've got all these fun little deformers to give it that nice squash and stretch. And then what I've done is duplicate this egg and pull it right up here into this Voronoi fracture. Same exact egg. If we were being really accurate, what we would be doing is copying and pasting all of these squash and stretch parameters right here, tucking them up in here. But for demo purposes, that runs a little slow, so we didn't do that this time around. But this egg right here is dedicated to these shatter pieces. And so what I've done is take that into face mode, and I simply just marqueed all of the top half of this egg out of here. We don't need it. It's not going to be shattering. You can get as granular with this selection as you would like. And in fact, it works a lot better the more granular you get, because essentially what we did was take the inverse alpha map that we use for this big egg onto this one here. So we're only seeing the pieces of this egg that we want to. And when you get really granular with this selection, it helps you make sure that these pieces behave very much the way you would expect them to. So I'll play through that one more time and out of this mode. And then we'll go back and look at the custom map that was used to treat all of these little Voronoi fracture pieces. So if I come back up here, we'll see that that little Voronoi fracture shatter egg was treated with the alpha map on the right. So we see we've got nothing happening in here until we need it to, right here. Because what we were looking for was this like money frame right here, like making sure that these fracture pieces looked like they could have plausibly been kicked out by these little birdie feet. And that is the spirit of animation, spending 48 hours on 2 frames, these 2 right here. But we feel really good about these now. So I really appreciate the flexibility that Cinema 4D gives me, and that I'm able to combine very simple techniques like this with more technical techniques and kind of benefit from both this very stylized approach, but also be able to benefit from the nice physics that I get in using a Voronoi fracture and letting Cinema kind of drive the bus when it comes to physics-driven simulations like that. So we're going to stop talking about the egg. The next thing that I do anytime I'm working in a brand project is I like to take my brand color palette, gather up all my hex codes, and then load those into a Cinema project so that anytime I'm working with a brand, I can hop right into Cinema and that palette's already locked and loaded, and I know that I'm working with approved colors in my project. So these just happen to be the brand colors for Ladybird Animation. And so what I'm going to do is hop right back over here into, I can close out some of these so I can find what I'm looking for. So in this project, all I've done is taken those same hex codes and put them up here so that I can see them, you can see them, and we know what we're working with. But anytime I'm working with a brand, I always like to go in here and load these in. And so if I hop into an Arnold surface, this trick does work with, let's see here, create materials. We'll do a new standard material. Hop in here, and we can see that we've got both this hex code here, and we've also got this palette that we can work with as well. I want to see both at the same time, so I'll hit Shift, select them both, and then I can just go through here, EE901E, and I can start dragging these in. Once I do that, you'll be prompted to name this palette, so I will. You've also got the option to make it global, which is really handy because as soon as you save this project, this palette will live in your Cinema preferences. And so anytime you're working with a brand throughout the course of your collaboration, you can simply open a project and this will be loaded automatically. So 81B 4A8. This process is obviously very self-explanatory, but we'll go through here. And we won't do the whole thing because we get the gist, but what I would do in theory is go through and put all of these into little color swatches, drag them in here. I've saved my project, and so now if I go to open a brand new, fresh project and grab me a Create Materials, New Standard Material, we will see down in our palette swatches that that's already been loaded, and it will stay loaded as long as we leave it there. You've got the option, of course, to clear out that palette once your brand partnership is over, but I find that just having this loaded in anytime I'm working with a brand helps me stay really consistent, stay on palette, and I'll also find that once I've finished the project, even though you're using your brand colors in 3D, I do like to, in post, usually still do a little bit of color pushing, and I'll either do that through the color remap tool in Magic Bullet Looks, or I'll go in and use some of the preset built-in features in After Effects. So that might be change color, change to color, to go in there and just kind of push all my renders into that really, really sacred brand space to make sure all of my colors feel really on brand, keeping all of our creative directors happy. But this is a super, super simple tip that I find really helps speed along my workflow when partnering with a brand. So scooting right along, the last demo that we're going to look at, if we take a look here, so I'm a very, very big stickler for animating by hand, a little bit old school, but I really enjoy that process. I do find sometimes that there are some things that can absolutely afford to be automated. And for me, that tends to be the little head feathers on top of Doris's head over here. They're a big part of her character. That's kind of how she emotes. And so we do find that they move anytime that she moves, and that's a lot to ask to be animating those by hand every scene that she's in. And so, granted, if Doris is kind of reacting to something, if something specific has happened and she's trying to emote and react to that thing, that's absolutely a case where I'll go in and animate those little feathers by hand to really sell that emotion. But in some cases, they just need to move, and that's all they need to do. So I can afford to automate that process. And so I will do so through dynamic joint chains in Cinema 4D. So that's what we're going to look at. In this scene, all I've done here is strip out that geometry from those head feathers and plot them in this scene right here. It is worth noting that this geometry does kind of live a little bit nested in Doris's geometry, so we never actually see this little triangle point that we're looking at right here. But I'm going to go through and start building out this very, very simplified joint chain. So I'm going to grab a joint, and it is worth noting that we are currently situated looking through the top camera of Cinema 4D because, as Rocket Lasso taught me, Cinema 4D joints are most stable when elongated along their Z-axis. And so all I'm doing right here is building out these little joint chains, nesting them underneath each other, and then I'm going to rotate these into place. Kind of where I expect them to start moving is about right there. And then I'll just duplicate these, start scooting them over, rotating them into place. This is obviously a very, very simple and forgiving rig because this is a very cartoony, simple little character. So you'll see there's really not going to be any sort of like center of gravity joint, no main joint kind of holding these all together. But I'll scoot these all into place here. Rotate, rotate. Beautiful, easy peasy. I found that I really only need these 3 joints to kind of define the movement that I want to see in these little head feathers. And then I find, this is my own personal naming convention that I find really helpful. Let's see here. This is the middle, base, and then joint, middle, excuse me, 01, and then middle, and okay. So I find that this little naming convention helps me because anytime I'm running any sort of search function, I know exactly how to find all of my joints when they're labeled like this. I also find that anytime I'm using any sort of dynamics or IK, I'm usually prompted to enter the end joint in the chain. And so naming my joints this way helps me get that really quick visual connection between where do my joint chains start, where do they end, and what are my dynamics asking for. So I'm going to go in here and rename these. Luckily, Cinema has got a super nifty tool for that as well. So I'll go in here to Tools, go to Naming Tool, and it's a very simple kind of search and replace function here. So I'm going to run that. Oh, look, I already did it. Rename. Just kidding. Just kidding. It works a lot better if I copied and pasted them first. So we'll just do it by hand, and that's totally fine. But this is left, base, and then joint, left, O1, and then joint, left, end. In theory, this tool works great when I set up my project properly, but we're almost there. Joint, right, base. This is the joint, O1, joint, right, O1, and then joint, right, end. Okay, easy peasy. So we've got all of our joints named. We've got them all set up properly. What I'm also going to do is go in here and give us a really simple controller to control these joints with. So I like to use a spline for those. I'll take this and I will rotate this into place. I'm going to put this roughly where Dottie's head would expect to start. So if you remember, her head usually kind of sits right here and the bottom of this geometry is tucked away. But we expect this movement to kind of kick in right about here. So I'm going to set this up as our controller, and I'll name this CNTL because that's my other naming convention, and I'll just call this head feathers. I'm going to group all of these joints together and just call this head feathers. And then I'm going to parent this group, rigging tags, constraint, and then I'll parent constraint this group of joints here over to this control that we've just set up right there. And then just for safekeeping, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to make sure and freeze all these transforms. So anytime I'm building a joint chain, I find myself using this command very frequently to keep all this nice and tidy, nice and clean. When in doubt, freeze it out. And so that is by no means official Maxon advice, but that's what I like to do. And so now we can see here, if we grab all of these joints, also grab our geometry, character, bind, hit OK. And now when we move this controller, we can see that we've got some nice control over these head feathers, but they're not really doing anything fun yet, and fun is what I want personally. So I'm going to go through here, and on all of my base joints, I'm going to right-click and set up, let's see here, rigging, IK. I'm going to set up an IK tag at the base of each joint. And if we look here, it is asking for the end. And so I'm going to go through here and link up the end joint of each of these chains and assign that. Usually it's also asking for a goal. A goal is great in an IK chain for if you want to have explicit control over that end joint in your chain. So for example, controlling the wrist at the end of an arm chain, that's where you'll definitely need a goal. In this case, I'm letting dynamics kind of drive the bus, and I'm letting Cinema 4D dynamics decide where the end of that joint chain ends up. So I don't need to define the goal here. So I'm going to bypass that. And I'm going to go through each of these, and I'm going to go to Dynamics and Enable. We'll see that looks absolutely disgusting. So I'm going to go over here and look at our perspective camera. And we'll see we're still kind of in the side axis here. I'm going to pull this straight up here. Ship it. I think that looks great. But we're going to go through and revise this a little bit. What I do find anytime I'm working with dynamic joint chains, I find that having some sort of base movement to kind of test that dynamics against is really, really helpful, because this by itself doesn't really tell me anything. So I'm going to animate this little joint chain here, this little controller, as if Doris was kind of like looking at something, as if something kind of caught her attention and she's responding to it. So we're going to do a little bit of baby animation here. I'm going to put a keyframe here, and then we're going to see kind of like a little bit of anticipation here. And then we're going to give it, like she's looking at something over here, a little bit of overshoot. And then we're going to let that settle a little bit here. If we go into our animation pane here, we can see that curve living right here. And because I've never left a curve alone in my life, I'm going to pull these out to give a nice, like, kind of snappy movement here. So let's see. Okay, Oscar winning, personally. But what we're seeing here is just a little bit of motion to test this rig against, to make sure it's moving the way we expect it to once it's in the environment that we can expect it to be living in. So we're looking at these here. And we're seeing we're getting some fun movement, but we want to have some art-directed movement here. So I'm going to go in and we'll just use, let's see, maybe this left joint chain as kind of our sample chain. So let's get familiar with some of these properties here. The dynamics tabs are really, really great. They've got some really great defaults here, but that's the thing, is that they are defaults for a reason, because they're super sturdy, really, really good parameters. But if you leave these on default, your work will look like everybody else's work who's leaving their dynamics on a default setting. And we want to make sure we're customizing these dynamics to really fit the brand voice. The brand voice for Ladybird Animation is kind of like a fun, cartoony brand voice we're trying to fit with this dynamic movement here. But something I'm also trying to keep in mind is, again, because this brand bird is reflected in our logo, it's really important to me that anytime she's done moving, that these little head feathers kind of land in an on-model position, so that anytime you see Doris in profile, you can make a clear connection between her and the logo. And I don't want these head feathers to ever land in a place that doesn't feel like her representation in the logo. So as we go through these parameters, I like to kind of translate these into more animation-focused terms. So strength, I like to think of as kind of a stiffness. How stiff is my joint chain? We'll find that this parameter and these two down here kind of work kind of in tandem a little bit. So think about if you're like driving a stick, you've got that relationship between your gas and your clutch, and they kind of have to do this to work well together. That's kind of how these parameters work. They've kind of got this inverse relationship here. So position hold is asking how badly do my joints want to stay in their original position. I'm leaving that alone because I'm not moving the physical position of these joints. I'm focused on the rotation though, and the rotation hold is asking how badly do these joints want to stay in their original rotation value. Drag here, you can kind of think about as if you're dragging your joint chain through water, maybe how viscous is that material. In animation terms, I like to think of it as kind of like a follow through. How cartoony is that follow through animation that I want to get in my secondary animation? So I do find that any value below 30 here, we start to kind of lose a little bit of the structural integrity of this rig, which is what we want because we want to get some fun follow through. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit here. I'm going to pull this up because I do like a good amount of cartoony follow through in my stuff. And then since we've pulled this value down, and that parameter does kind of have an inverse relationship with this one down here, I'm going to pull this one up a little bit to make sure that we're landing on model. So if we take a look at that, we can see we're getting some nice like follow through animation. We're still going from point A to point B, and point B looks like our on model shape, but in the middle some fun stuff is happening, and that's what I want. And so I'm going to go through here and I'm just going to simply copy these parameters into our other dynamic setup. So we've got, let's see, 22, 58, 58, 100, and what was that, 41. All right. Okay, so when I look at these values here, I find that I'm getting some fun follow-through animation. We're still landing in an on-model place, and it's also nice that we're getting this feedback in the viewport. We're not having to render to see what this looks like, which is really, really helpful. We're getting some nice real-time feedback of these joint chains. And so I think these values are in a good spot. We can noodle forever, but I'll leave those there. Something else I want to talk about really, really quick is if we take a look at the frame rate of this project, we'll see that this project is set up at 24 frames a second. But at this point, I like to work in drop frame treatments most of the time. I like for my work to have this really like chunky childlike feel, and I kind of like to work in a stop motion world. What I had been doing previously was animating in 24 and then dragging it over into After Effects and posterizing there, and bringing my project down to 12 frames a second in After Effects to get that really nice stop motion feel. For this project, I thought I want to try doing that in cinema so I can see what I'm working with and I can animate at 12, see how that feels, and just give that a swing. And so I went in here and I turned my project down to 12 frames a second to start animating in drop frame. And my heart broke because this is what I got. And we don't love that. So that really made me sweat before my project deadline. But luckily Cinema had come out with this new feature that really saved my bacon on this project. So I'm going to go up to my animated property, which is not really the joints, it's actually this controller up here. And I'll right click and go to animation tags. And Cinema's come out with the track modifier. So if you go in here, there's a lot of really fun properties you can mess around with in here. But my personal favorite is this posterization feature, which kind of, again, mimics what we were getting in After Effects. When you bring your project in at whatever frame rate, you bring it in, you posterize it, and you can drop it down to 12, 8, whatever your treatment. And we find we can do that here in Cinema as well. So when I put that frame step up to 2, we find that not only have, hold on. We have to go back and we have to set our frame rate to 24. Okay, we all feel a lot better about that now. So we find that our dynamics are not only behaving the way we expect them to, but that we're also getting that nice like drop frame treatment, that kind of stop motion animation feel. And we're not having to rebuild our dynamics chain to recalculate at this new frame rate. And so this parameter gives us a lot of freedom in terms of stylizing animation, which is a personal favorite of mine. I love to work in really stylized worlds. And so what this gives us is the freedom to essentially animate different characters at different frame rates within your scene, which is really exciting. It also gives you the opportunity to separate the frame rate of your camera from your character. So you've got really smooth camera moves with maybe characters moving at a much more drop frame treatment throughout your scene. So you're no longer limited to a single frame rate, which is really exciting. As a stylized animator, I know I'll be coming back and using this parameter very, very frequently. So with that, we're going to do a quick recap. We essentially talked about breaking down 2 big brand animations into their core elements and how do we translate those core elements into a set of reliable visuals to translate our brand ideas. And then a couple of practical ways that we did that. We're essentially building out a shape library, talking about some spline animation options in Cinema 4D, intentional camera selection to really communicate the vibe of our brand, those nice undertones that we get as we change our camera lenses around, and then customizing the dynamics of Cinema 4D to really fit our brand voice. So in that case, we customized both a Voronoi fracture along with a dynamic joint chain, and then we also loaded our brand color palette into Cinema to keep everything really, really consistent and really on brand. And so with that, those were the end of our brand animations. Thank y'all so much.
All right, great job, Alex.
Thank you.
I always love that bird. It's just relaxing.
Oh, thank you. Me too. Me too.
Relaxing.
It's my gal.
Great. We do have some time for some live questions with Alex. After here, Alex will be at the Dell booth at the very end. We have a little demo station, so if you have more questions for her, you'll be able to chat with her there. We can do it live, and she might be able to show you something. If you do have a question, just raise your hand. And it looks like you did a perfect job, as usual. Absolutely.
Great.
Understood everything.
That's what we love.
That's great. All right, well, stick around. Our next presenter will be up shortly, and we'll see you right after this quick break. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all.